Okay, tells me I'm live. So, hello guys. This is Professor O'Brien here with a short lecture this week on how adults learn language. Now, this obviously connects up to the second half of this unit, which is the use of technology in language learning. And that's also where I want you to read the PDF documents. I'm probably not going to put much of a lecture up on them because I think they're self-explanatory. I don't think there's anything in those documents that's tricky. I might put up something on the exercise, which I don't think is tricky. The directions are fairly clear, but it does involve using technology. So I would like you to feel as comfortable as possible with that. But we'll see. Depends on time. I'm going to get all this done by the end of Friday morning, and I'm going to put up what I can, but I'm going to stop at that point because your assignments are due Friday night, and there's no point making you wait for things that aren't going to be arriving in a timely manner. Okay, chapter 13 opens with how children learn language. This is an excellent part of the chapter. It's not part of the assigned reading, but if you are considering education as a major, if you work with children, if you're interested in how you acquired your native language, it's a very important and a very interesting section of the chapter. Note at the bottom of page 223 the use of the term L1. Now, linguists refer to L1, L2, L3. Your L1 is your native language. It's the language you grew up with. Your L2 is a second language you've learned as an adult, and you'll often find linguists distinguishing between learning and acquiring. You acquire your native language. That is to say, you don't really put a lot of work into it. A baby doesn't sit down with a grammar book to figure out what language is being spoken around them. Just through observation and through necessity to communicate with the people around them, they acquire the language they need. There's no classes. Now, from later childhood into adulthood, you might learn a second language. This isn't the same as acquisition. It typically involves textbooks, practice, classrooms, professors, and the like. Some interesting statistics here. You might be surprised at how few learners of a second language ever actually master it. I don't know if that will make you feel better about the language that you are taking on campus, your language requirement. Don't beat yourself up if you don't achieve fluency. Very few people do achieve fluency, but if you can get yourself to a position where you're relatively comfortable with a verb paradigm and you can order a pint of beer in a bar in that target language, congratulations, you've done well. Okay. Pages, the chapter starts out with how babies go about acquiring a language. Page 224 reminds us that senses are important. You've got to be able to hear to learn a spoken language. And motor learning is important. You have to be able to speak to actually, you have to be able to move your lips and your tongue to speak. The third ticked item in the 4-item list on page 224, speech perception. You have to be able to number one, distinguish just typical noise around you. Distinguish language from the typical noise around you. And that involves a great amount of brain activity. Also, an ability to filter out human language going on around you that's not germane to what's going on in your sphere. So ignoring a conversation over there when you're talking to somebody here. And finally, once you've mastered those, then marshalling your tongue and your lips and everything else to make language, speech production. That's hard to do. Now, let's look at this third item there, how infants perceive speech. You have to remember, infants aren't born being able to distinguish one word from another. How does an infant with no sense of language know when one word ends and another begins? Because in the flow of ordinary human speech, there isn't actually a space there. There isn't a silence between words. Words flow into each other. Now, it seems that what they're doing, the text says here, cracking the code at the bottom of the page, is that they're simply applying statistics. If you hear one sound after another more often than another sound after that, then there's a pattern. So they're spending enough time listening to language that they're figuring out patterns. Look at the second paragraph there on page 226, describing infants as expert statisticians, keeping score of what sounds hang out together. Now, note the order in which infants start producing language. Firstly, they cry, or they smile as well. They know how to get a response from the parents, even if they haven't got language officially. Then they start to coo. Page 227 there. Not quite syllables, but language noise. And they know also this cooing gets a response from the people around them. Bottom of page 227, they're babbling. They're actually making syllables. Ba, 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 ka, 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 da, 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 da. Might not be real language, but you can, the surmise is that they are exercising the language organs in preparation for real language. By 12 months, they're starting to make one-word sentences. There's a few examples provided halfway down page 229 there. Between 18 and 24 months, that is to say somewhere just before the second year, they're making two-word sentences. That is to say they're real sentences. Doggy bark. Noun phrase, verb phrase, right? Now, after that, things go crazy, which is to say the language circuitry has been readied and now it comes into full use. Vocabulary starts to skyrocket, length of utterances starts to skyrocket, etc. There's an interesting table on page 230, the order in which kids acquire grammatical morphemes. You can see they acquire the ing form first. I'm eating, dog walking, dog barking, whatever. And the very last morphological morpheme they acquire, number 14 at the top of page 231, is the reduced forms of the verb to be. They're here, as in they are here. Okay, I'm going to float over the rest. Note that it's only in after the third or fourth year that a child can ask a question, because that involves movement. Remember, we spoke about movement in the syntax portion of this course. So they understand, for instance, man sees dog, who sees man? More or less meaning, what does the man see? And you can see the who or the what, that WH word has moved to the start of the sentence. How does a child learn that? Relative clauses might seem simple to you. There's the guy who ate my dog. But a relative clause is a little sentence embedded in another sentence. That's quite sophisticated. There's some examples of children before their third year embedding clauses. That's fairly sophisticated. Okay, there's an interesting but relatively, well, it's an interesting discussion about nature and nurture. Do we have built-in language circuitry in our brains? This text leans towards saying we do, but the behavioralists would say not so fast. What we might be doing is adapting existing circuitry, not necessarily linguistic circuitry, for communication. And that would suggest that it's more nurture than nature. Now, let's accept what the text says, that the jury hasn't come back with a full decision there, so we'll accept both nature and nurture. The bottom of page 235 there moves towards the nature acquisition approach, positing that there is a critical language period. There's an age beyond which you cannot learn a language. It's usually in your mid-teens. That is to say, there's an age beyond which you can't acquire a language. I'm not so certain about that. I'm inclined to think that it becomes very difficult to acquire a language after your mid-teens because you've developed number one, the realization that you already have a language. Why learn another one? And number two, a certain amount of embarrassment about making sounds that aren't natural to your own language. We know how teens are, very exclusionary. That person is different from us, we won't let her into our gang. It's much the same with language. Speaking another language makes you different, and teenagers and adults don't like being different. So it could be that. There's a considerable amount of discussion about this, that your brain is wired for language and the ability to rewire the brain shuts down in your mid-teens. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to say that I fully agree. I've met enough people who have put the work in and pretty much acquired a second language after their teens, but they really need to be motivated. They really need motivation. Okay. Now, officially, the reading for this chapter begins at page 238 there. Mastering language later in life. Slow and hard. Slow and hard for kids too. A kid is not speaking fully fluently with passive sentences and relative clauses until the age of 6 or 7. That's 6 or 7 years of slog. To acquire a native language, you need to be exposed to it 24 hours a day for 6 or 7 years. It's probably the case that you need to put the same amount of work in for a second language as an adult. So again, not much surprise there that not many adults pick up second languages. The big question for this part of the course is, can technology help? Has technology helped? Have you used technology successfully or unsuccessfully to acquire language? Now, you'll remember some of the assignments for this unit of the course are to install some language apps on your smartphone and your laptop and see how you feel about them. And I'm also asking you to write a short essay on this as well. Note that statistic. 2/3 of the way down page 238. 80% of students of English as a second language are beginners and never get beyond that point. Okay, page 239. One of the problems of learning a target language is transfer errors, which is to say, if you have a native language, you're likely to try to apply the rules of that native language to the target language. sometimes it works, sometimes not. I found, for instance, that my excellent knowledge of English allowed me to learn German a lot faster because both languages are Germanic languages, and I was able to transfer things that I knew from English into German. Would that work with Chinese? I don't think so. I think Chinese and English are too far apart. There isn't a great deal you can transfer into your learning of Chinese. And the point here is that you might try and then make inadvertent errors in the target language. So there's an example provided on page 239 there. Russian doesn't have articles. It doesn't have a or the, which means that if you're trying to learn a sentence like "to the victor belong the spoils," a speaker of Russian, not knowing what to do with those articles, might learn "to victor belong spoils," which is more or less what you'd say in Russian, but not correct in English. So they've applied transfer and failed. Negative transfer. An Italian speaker would say something like, or at least they would use an infinitive where you use a present participle. So an English speaker might say, "We won't take it lying down." An Italian would try, "We won't take it to lie down," which sounds right to his ears, but isn't right in the target language. Negative transfers. Performance errors. Well, my jury's out. I've spoken about this performance thing before. The point is that when push comes to shove, your brain, having learnt a second language, might fall back on your first language. So let's say that you're a fluent speaker of Italian and you're out for a walk in Rome and you fall into the Tiber. Are you going to have the presence of mind to shout for help in Italian? Or are you going to fall back on your English? As it says here, you may flounder when you try to have an open-ended conversation. And you might say things like, "Do you bought this too?" instead of, "Did you buy this too?" Now, we've spoken about universal grammar briefly in the past. Now, I argue that it exists, but I think Chomsky may have put too much emphasis on it. The point of universal grammar is, as human beings, as linguistic human beings, our brains work much the same way. Our perception of the world works much the same way, which is why an episode of an American comedy can still play on Japanese TV and be laughed at, because there are universals. Now, if there are cultural universals, are there language universals? Well, yes, kind of. There are nouns, there are verbs, there are doers, there are actions, there are receivers of actions. Now, I'm going to reject the suggestion halfway down page 240 right off the bat. It says here, "Only universal grammar principles guide L2 learners," which is to say, you acquire your L2, you learn your L2 without the influence of other languages. I think that's nonsense. There are always going to be transfer errors. You're always going to be trying tricks you've learned from your native language as you learn a target language. And I'm going to accept the second suggestion at the bottom of page 240 there, that not only do you have full access to universal grammar, which is to say your human brain and your human language acquiring circuitry, but transfer is going to interfere with that, both positively and negatively. Now, we know that transfer errors occur. The grade box on page 241 reminds us of this. Number one, parallelism. You learn your target language using phonological rules that you know from your L1. So a speaker of Egyptian Arabic will say something like filor instead of floor, because F and L don't come together in Egyptian Arabic. Now, a speaker of Iraqi Arabic might take another approach and say iflor, allowing the F and the L to come together. We're pretty sure that the L1s are having an effect because every Egyptian learner of English makes the same kind of error and says filor instead of floor. So you can see, if you take 10 Egyptian learners of English and they all make the same error, you can be pretty sure that their Egyptian Arabic is affecting the way they're learning English in the same way. It's homogeneous. Now, we can also use the null hypothesis as proof as well. If you take a learner of Egyptian Arabic, an Egyptian learner of English, and analyze the errors he makes as he learns English, you might expect to see the same errors from a Chinese person or a Swahili speaker or a speaker of Japanese or a speaker of Irish Gaelic. And yet, it's not the case. The pattern of errors you see from an Irish Gaelic speaker as they learn English is going to be different from the pattern you see in speakers of Egyptian Arabic, Iraqi Arabic as it happens, Chinese, Japanese, and whatever it might be. So three good reasons, three pieces of evidence that L1s do affect the way we learn L2s. Now, universal grammar does come into the problem presented to us in the box on page 242. It's hard enough for an infant, but imagine how hard it is for an adult learner of, let's say, Spanish, to generalize grammar rules from perhaps the only 4 or 5 examples they've heard. One from a textbook, one from a teacher, and one heard on the TV, maybe, if they had the Spanish on. An infant, however, might hear it 100 times. This is called, as the box says, the poverty of the stimulus problem. How does an adult learner of a language, how can that person generalize rules? Now, the text, I think, is it's avoiding the observation that there are 2 ways to learn a target language. Now, a great deal of you guys will have an uncle or an aunt, maybe even a parent, maybe a grandparent, who arrived in the United States with no English and possibly very little education. So their desire to take classes was low. So their only source of English is going to be the television and speakers of English around them. And there might not be many speakers of English around them. There you have a poverty of stimulus problem, because they aren't going to formally learn the rules of the target language. They're only going to learn the English they can learn from the people around them. And that they aren't going to have many opportunities for that. But there's the other possibility, and that is, given poverty of stimulus, would it not be possible to formally bestow the rules of the target language using a text. Now, that's what your language professors here at the university are trying to do. They're trying to make up for the poverty of the stimulus by telling you, here's how a sentence in the target language is formed. Here's how a relative clause in the target language is formed. Here's how the sounds in the target language are made. Now, the problem here is that if the sum total of your exposure to the target language is still just 2 semesters of a college course where you meet a professor who may or may not be a native speaker himself twice a week, you're probably still not going to learn a great deal. I would say, however, if you are motivated to learn a language and you're happy to be exhausted at the end of every day, you might well take yourself off to a place, Mexico City, Madrid, where nothing but your target language is spoken. I'm talking about Spanish in this case, and take classes at the same time. So not only are you acquiring the rules in a formal way, which means you don't have to observe all the time, make statistical observations, but they're actually handed to you on a plate, but you get the chance to speak the language in a 24-hour situation. That might solve that problem. Now, the second ticked observation on page 242, absence of negative evidence. The point here, which is labored, is that children are frequently presented through correction with erroneous sentences that they are told are wrong. And that's how they learn things are wrong, and by extension, what things are right. But in the absence of negative evidence, how do we know something is wrong? And that's a problem if you have, if you're approaching fluency, say, but nobody has ever corrected you. You can land into your target country and try something out that should be right. Your common sense is telling you, I think I can do this, but nobody's ever corrected you. So it's only when you land in that you realize that can't be said in the target language. And it might be something very subtle. So what does an adult have to do to master a target language? Take a look on page 243 here, because I think this is the kernel of your problem. And can technology solve this? You tell me. Number one, you have to figure out the sound system. Now, with European languages, that might not be so difficult because so many sounds are shared between languages. Is it acceptable? I'm just going to pull out a Spanish book if I can find one. There. Is it so awful to try Spanish using English pronunciation? El reloj de la Catedral de Lima acababa de dar las 7. Aunque no era muy tarde, las calles de la ciudad ya estaban envueltas en las sombras de la noche. Now, that sets me off as a gringo. And I'm exaggerating a bit, obviously, but I've heard people speak Spanish that way. But a speaker of Spanish would probably understand what you're saying. Not so, however, if you have to move outside the European language comfort zone. What if you're trying to learn Swahili or Chinese or an Aboriginal language in Australia, where the sound system is completely different? So you do have to figure out the sound system of the language. How does it form syllabi? What sounds are permitted? What sounds are not permitted? Etc. The second hurdle is recognizing words. Now, you've all had this experience. You've all put the Spanish on the TV at some stage. I'm just providing Spanish as an example. It might be Italian or French or something else for you. And it's just been a long flow of gobbledygook. Now, that's how English sounds to learners of English. Now, gradually, the more you hear this language, the more you learn how to segment, how to tell sentences and syllabi apart. But it takes a lot of practice. And until you can do that, it's very hard to learn new words. Because if all you're hearing is gabbly, 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 how are you going to look up a word in that string if you aren't able to distinguish it from the rest of the sounds you heard? So you have to learn how to segment. And so I would tell you, if you're trying to master, let's say, Spanish, I strongly recommend that in the car on the way to work, for instance, or in the car on the way to campus, put a Spanish station on or put a Spanish podcast on or something. You might not understand a word, but your brain is working subconsciously to segment it all the time. It will work to your advantage. Yeah. Okay. Barrier number 3. Within 6 months, you might have 1,000 words. At that stage, you can put several of them together, and you can use short chunks you've learned by heart. ¿Dónde está el treno? Easy to say. ¿Cómo te llamas? Easy again. The fourth obstacle, can you put sentences together? This is a big challenge, and it might take over a year. You might have about 3,000 words, but can you hold a conversation? We've all been in that situation, I suspect, where we have enough Spanish to get ourselves into trouble. So I walk into the store and I say, tiene bolígrafos. And the person in the store wants to tell me, well, they're actually out of ballpoint pens, but there's going to be a shipment in about 3 hours. Can I come back in the afternoon? They've just gone off script. I haven't a clue what they've just said. However, you're at the border there between ability to hold a conversation and ability to string sentences together. Now, 4 to 10 years after that, you should be in a position where it says here you can dream and joke in a second language. I don't know if you dream in any language, honestly, but imagine the amount of extra linguistic information you need to be able to tell a joke. You have to know your target culture intimately to be able to tell a joke. You have to be able to use idiom. You have to be able to use slang. And you have to be able to know the cues for storytelling. So apropos of nothing and everything, take a look at the points that the text gives us on page 244, the ideal second language learner. These factors make a positive contribution to second language learning. Your linguistic knowledge. The more English you have, the more linguistically confident you're going to be, the easier it is going to be to learn other languages. The more meta-linguistic information you have, knowledge of what a verb is, a noun is, an adjective, etc., knowledge of what a clause is, the more you can apply that in other situations. Because of universal grammar, of course. Every language has sentences. Every language has nouns and verbs. If you know these categories, you can start analyzing target languages a lot faster. Second point, your cultural knowledge. And this is important, and it's something that was left out of language teaching for years. We're going to teach you Latin. Okay, here's 1,000 words you need to learn by heart. But why? Why would anyone learn 1,000 words without having good reason to do so? So if you're, I always tell students, if you're picking a language, don't just pick it because you think it'll get you a job afterwards. Too many people, for instance, choose Spanish, particularly if they're planning on going into health services or education, because they have this idea they'll be able to communicate with patients or students or parents. I would say that you need more than that. You need a cultural reason to learn a target language. You have to be interested in that target culture. Otherwise, it's going to be boring, uninteresting, engaging with that language. Third point, your language aptitude. Well, okay. We know that people with damage to the left side of their brains find it harder to learn and master languages. It might just be, as the text says here, that you just don't have the circuitry for it. I don't buy that. Everybody masters a native language. Why can't they master a second language? But you really have to have a desire to do it. Think about cultural aptitude. How apt are you to want to know more things about Hispanic culture? And that is also covered under the fourth tick there. So that's what I wanted to talk about with adult acquisition of language. I might briefly look into the other material and then I'll call it a day for lectures. So I hope this is useful, and I'll be talking to you again next Wednesday. Please be sure to have the assignments done. Otherwise, I won't have anything to read and I won't have anything to prepare class with. So see you then.